Well, since we're only doing one reading, one class basically on Aristotelian ethics, Aristotle's ethics, um, certain things cannot be gone into. They're just too much. Aristotle's ethics is extremely interesting and leads in all sorts of different directions, but certain aspects of it you need to spend a longer time with it, or the concepts don't really mean much. But for our one reading, since it really is the central topic, is this notion of virtue. Virtue is one of those words that has a long history, and it shows you, how the vagaries of history and language can produce something strange. Virtue is an English word. Okay, it's a perfectly good word that we use in the English language, but it comes from the Latin, and the um, the root of the Latin word is vir or vir, which means man, male, male of the species. So for the Romans, really, virtue meant manliness, but it has changed, and really, since Aristotle's writing in Greek, we're using it as a translation of a Greek word. So we have an English word that's based on Latin, which is being used as a translation of an ancient Greek word. That's just the way it is with language. And that Greek word is arete, which has a much wider meaning than manliness, and probably closer to the contemporary English usage of virtue, and that is really arete, which in its most general form means excellence. But really, an arete is virtue in the sense that it's a character trait that we should like to have. The opposite is what we call vice. So, excuse me, a virtue is an excellence of character, then vice is a defect of character. So, Aristotle's ethics and much of Greek thought and morality really center on this idea of arete, or excellence. What are the virtues? What are the character traits that everyone should have? And how do we acquire them? And that's where things, I think, get really interesting. Because at least when it comes to what Aristotle calls moral virtue, the idea is that it's a habit. Why? Well, I mean, the typical moral virtue for the Greeks was courage. That is a virtue. The Greeks said there were four virtues that everyone should have, and they're the base foundation for being a good person. And those were wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. Those were the four major, absolutely have to have virtues. And courage is an interesting one. It really fits the Aristotelian idea that virtue is a habit. It's moral virtue, at least, as opposed to something like wisdom. Moral virtue is how we deal with our feelings, and getting the right balance between our feelings is how we become virtuous in these sense. Think about the virtue of courage. Like all moral virtues, the virtue is in how we deal with feelings, and the feeling that's in play here is fear. Courage is about how we deal with fear, and Aristotle has two ideas I think that are absolutely crucial. The first is that you acquire the virtue by habit, and that the virtue itself is a mean. Take the first idea first. What does he mean that you acquire a virtue like courage by habit? Well, you practice. You practice. Getting a virtue, moral virtue, is a lot like learning how to play a musical instrument. You repeat it so many times that it becomes second nature to you. If you try to um, withstand your fear in fearful situations, if you do that often enough, you will just naturally do it. You'll do what feels right. Because what is something like courage? Well, it's how you deal with your fear, but you want to achieve what he calls the mean, and the mean is the kind of balance between extremes. If courage is how we deal with our fear, then cowardice is having too much fear, more fear than it is proper. Whereas having too little fear is bad too. Then you do things that are rash. You achieve the virtue, the mean point, when you feel just the right amount of fear that fits the situation. Now, exactly where that is, it's impossible to say, but Aristotle's relying upon our intuitions. We know where the extremes are. If you're a soldier in battle, and at the first sight of the enemy, you just turn around and run, then you feel too much fear. If, on the other hand, when at the first sight of the enemy, you just rush up by yourself individually, ready to take on the whole opposing army, then you feel too little fear. What you want is somewhere in between. Now, where exactly that point is impossible to say, but it's somewhere between the extremes, and that's how he thought of moral virtue, as a mean between two extremes. As another example, just one more example, something like less important virtue to him, but certainly one that he would have recognized. It's generosity. Generosity is how we deal with our feelings of sympathy and pity. If you let those feelings, if you have none of those feelings at all, that is, if you don't feel like you have any obligation to give to people who are in great need, you're a miser. Let's call that miserliness. On the other hand, if you give away everything to everybody, I don't even know if there's a word for that, being over generous, I guess. So the virtue of generosity is hitting that, that sweet spot, you might say. Not too much, not too little, sort of the Goldilocks spot between the extremes. It's like sort of figuring out how much to tip. You know, I mean, there are excessive tips just as there are rotten tips. They're too low or not tipping at all. Um, Tips that are just excessive. There's no reason to tip that much. Um, but if you're giving somebody nothing, that's not good either. So, I mean, yeah, whatever it is, people tip 20% these days. Just do that. Most people just do that. But if you're thinking about it, you want to hit that point where you're being generous but not excessive. If you're overcome with your sympathy for the waiter, it may be a little bit too much, right? So you can think about different moral virtues this way. Um, you know, I don't know, anger. How do we deal with our anger? You know, if somebody does something to offend you, you have a right to get angry. But how angry should you get? Well, you don't want to be a pushover, but then again, you don't want to overreact. So, how we deal with our anger is an important part of our character, and that's what all these virtues are. Ultimately, they're a part of our character, and this idea that we practice is really about growing up. You have to be in enough situations where you have to make these decisions before you can develop the kind of habits that would establish your character, and hopefully a good character with the virtues rather than a bad character with vices.